So welcome to the first of 4 public art talks here at the Lesley MFA in Visual Arts June 2020 residency. I'm the director of the program, Ben Sloat. Our general thematic for this residency is, quote, social abstraction, which considers the means to process, transform, and artistically respond to social contexts, as well as the spectrum of abstraction present within the social fabric itself. Our programs began yesterday with my faculty talk on art value and social abstraction and remarks by art critic Jerry Saltz on next days in the art world. And we'll continue tomorrow with a talk by mixed media sculptor Ursula von Reitingsward, Wednesday with our visiting faculty Anthony Romero, and Thursday with the mixed media artist Eric N. Mack. And I hope those watching the YouTube live stream on the front page of our website can join us for those programs. I'm excited to introduce today's speaker, artist and activist Carrie Moyer, who is a founding member of the faculty here in our MFA program when we were based before on the other side of the Charles River and known as the Art Institute of Boston at Lesley University. And I'm thrilled to have her back in our program today as the first visiting artist speaker for this residency. Carrie Moyer's work combines various approaches of painterly forms and applications, generating unique visions and politically tinged juxtapositions the artist describes as, quote, cross-listed. Recent solo exhibitions include those at the Tang Museum and the Worcester Art Museum, and group shows include the 2017 Whitney Biennial and those at the Brooklyn Museum and Mannheimer Kunstverein. She is the director of the MFA program in studio art at Hunter College in New York. Please join me in welcoming Carrie Moyer.
Should I be sharing my screen now?
Alrighty.
All right. Hello, everybody. This is very peculiar doing this, as you know. And let me just get settled here. That's better for me. So I will just be talking to my slides, I guess. I'm really delighted to be welcomed back to Lesley. As Ben mentioned, I was one of the early faculty in the program, along with a number of you who are there now, I imagine, in the audience, including Laurel and Jan and Stuart and Deborah, and I'm sure I'm forgetting someone important, Oliver. But thank you so much for having me back. I thought today, since we are in the middle of a kind of tidal wave of public sentiment against injustice following the murder of George Floyd, I would talk about how I have seen the intertwining of activism and abstract painting in my own work. And I wanted to start with a show that's actually up at the Portland Museum of Art in Portland, Maine right now, that I did with my partner and my wife, sculptor Sheila Pepe. The show is called Carrie Moyer and Sheila Pepe, Tabernacles for Trying Times. And if you look at the label I put on the upper left corner, it says Scary Moyer. So obviously some kind of Freudian slip going on there. Anyway, we had been working on this show for about a year or maybe a year and a half, thinking that we are in this incredibly fraught moment politically, and trying to figure out a way to use a museum as a place to bring people with different points of view together. And so we sort of landed on the word tabernacle as a place of both reflection and a tent under which we could all join, in the sense of the big tent as was used politically in the 20th century. Something that would be inclusionary. So Sheila and I came up with this space in which we made all these different aspects. Sheila made these chairs that are based on Roman seating. And let me go to the next slide. And I made these clouds, which were clearly inspired by Sheila's work, sort of combining my own shapes So we wanted to make a gathering space for people to come and talk about different issues. And we worked extremely closely with the programming department of the Portland Museum of Art and came up with a fabulous list of events and things that were meant to happen in this place that we called Parlor for the People inside the Portland Museum of Art. This is a sort of side view. Amongst the many different aspects of the show, it's a group show. It's a two-person show in which we each have about 20 works of our own, and then a collection of works we've made together over the years, and sort of culminating in this centerpiece, which is a kind of parlor for people to participate in. In the foreground, you see a kneeler that Sheila made called American Bardo. In the background, the very heavy crocheting is a piece she titles Common Sense, in which viewers were meant to come in and unravel a piece of crocheting into their own handiwork, be it a scarf, or someone was making dog jackets one day. Nonetheless, or needless to say rather, the show was closed in the middle of March, so it had only been open about 3 or 4 weeks. And the space that we thought long and hard and collaborated with our curator, Jamie D. Simone, and the staff at the museum on how to actually get people in the museum and use it as a space for dialogue, lay bare and empty and without inhabitants for the last couple months. So they reopened last week. Here's the three of us giving our artist lecture. I wanted to start with this because I think in my own work, I have moved in and out of both activism and collaboration in different ways. And this is sort of the newest manifestation that I've been lucky enough to do with my partner, and think about how art lives in a sort of social context, especially as two people who make abstract art, how that interacts with, say, what's going on right now politically, how it can inform it, how it can react to it. I'm just going to show a couple of images of recent paintings, and then I'm going to go into a kind of chronology to think about how a certain moment in time can change one's studio practice radically. So this is a large painting, 92 inches, that I recently made expressly for the show at the PMA. And it sort of sits at the end of Parlor for the People. Each of us made specific work in response to the idea of the show that was included in the show. And Sheila and I had recently spent 3 months in Italy, and just being around a kind of built environment in which everything is steeped in history, and also layer upon layer of making, unmaking, pattern, different types of materials, has kind of seeped into the next few images that you're going to see that I made since coming back from our residency. And another part of this, as a kind of art historical scavenger, I have moved through different periods of art history as sort of inflection points in my own work. One that's very well known to most people is color field painting. These days, precipitated partly by the show at the ICA in Boston on pattern and decoration, I'm really interested in looking back at that movement of P&D and thinking about how it aligns with another time of intense activism in the art world, and a sort of breakdown of hierarchies around what is considered quote unquote fine art, what is art and craft, what is women's work, all of the things that are very common to our discourse at this point are sort of embedded in the movement of pattern and decoration. And I see that as a place of further investigation for me. So you'll see most of these paintings are very much in the vein that one would expect from me, but they also start to include passages of pattern that operate as different kinds of inflection points inside the painting, perhaps bringing you to a different space or dealing with flatness in a different way. And I've also begun to use a lot of graphite in my paintings, which is hard to see in this one, but those sort of cloud forms in the background are drawn onto the canvas. So one advent of not being in the US for 3 months is thinking about new materials, new imagery, ways of bringing a different kind of discourse into my own work. And here's one more picture. I have been interested in the idea of returning to the picture plane as a place to enter. And that's kind of a continuum that you'll see throughout the slides that I show you today. It's like what happens beyond the picture plane. If we've rejected this idea of illusionism, how can we play with both states of being? I'm interested in a kind of destabilized space in which the viewer is very close and perhaps very far from different aspects of the painting all at the same time. These paintings, if you've ever seen one in person, have very rich surfaces, textured, lots of things on the canvas. This one has garden sand on it, plus a lot of other things. So to sort of enter into the next phase of this talk, and I'm very interested in this idea of social abstraction. I had no idea this was the overall umbrella for this session of Lesley. How do we arrive at something like social abstraction? And what is social abstraction? I'm going to use the next bit of my talk to discuss how, as a young woman, I grew up completely revering American abstraction. I grew up in Oregon, mostly on the West Coast, and knew I wanted to live in New York and be a painter and be out as a lesbian. I felt very confined as a child, and I had a very romantic view of what moving to New York and being a lesbian artist would be. Of course, one's experience is totally different than that fantasy. So I arrived in New York in the 80s when everything was really decrepit and pretty crime ridden. I went to Pratt, it was pretty dangerous. I had, 27 freelance jobs. I couldn't afford to do anything I wanted to do. And I was sort of actively discriminated against as a lesbian. So how do those things intersect with my own desire and fantasy about what it is to be an artist? And granted, this thing that I just described about the New York art scene is such a 20th century version of being an artist. So I'm showing you a couple of paintings that I did at Pratt. I was lucky enough when I was a student at Pratt to become an intern at Heresy's magazine, which was a feminist magazine started by women artists that dealt with politics and art, specifically feminist politics. And it was the first of its kind. It was quite radical. Every issue was made by a different collective around specific topics. So as a young woman, I was working alongside older women artists who very much acted as mentors to me and role models in terms of how one could combine activism and art making. And you'll see some of this work is from the early 80s. I'm already thinking very much about people like Ana Mendieta and the idea of essentialist tropes around vaginal imagery and what does like quote unquote women's art look like, and then also trying to think about that in the context of abstraction. At a certain point, becoming dead broke, not being able to afford a studio, being very much alive to the things that were going on around me, which was the AIDS epidemic, I started to get involved with activism. And probably because I had such a kind of emotional and philosophical crisis around what was an abstract painting for, what was it good for, given the fact that we are in this sort of critical moment. I moved into doing agitprop and graphic design. So I'm just going to show you some of the things I did during that period of my life to set up a discussion around queer abstraction, which I'll get to later on. These were some stickers. Remember the days when there were actually wheat pasting on the street and people put stickers in phone booths and ATMs. These were stickers that we started to use as part of Queer Nation. Remember, this is the moment in which people are thinking about outing and, you know, in certain ways, the difference between the gains that African Americans have made since the 70s and the gains gay people have made since the 70s is radically different. And of course, that has to do completely with white supremacy and access to institutions of power. You know, remember Anthony Fauci was the person in charge of dealing with the AIDS epidemic. He is reincarnated as the pandemic czar. This is a postcard that my collaborator and we started something called Dyke Action Machine. I'm not going to go into this too much. There's a lot of information online if you want to find out more about us. We both worked in advertising, and we decided in the, you know, being inspired by artists like Jenny Holzer and Barbara Kruger and a number of other activist groups at the time, such as Silence Equals Death, to start our own project called Dyke Action Machine. And it was two of us. We did everything anonymously. So for many years, people thought Dyke Action Machine was a large group. This is a postcard project in which we come out as Dyke Action Machine. But mainly these were things that were pasted on the street in response to the idea of who gets seen in mainstream media, how does mainstream culture use or abuse marginalized peoples. In this case, during the 90s, there was a lot of discussion about gay consumers and whether they could be used to brand things. And I would just bring it back to this moment because I think we're seeing all over the place, especially in the city I live in Soho, where stores like Louis Vuitton are asking Black Lives Matter activists to paint on their plywood covered windows. I mean, there's something so patently offensive about that and hollow. Yet we are in this moment in which activism signifies a certain kind of consciousness and will be used no matter what. And yes, this started a long time ago. So the primary aim, or one of the aims of Dyke Action Machine, was to bring images of lesbians onto the streets of New York City. These posters were all wheat pasted, as like advertising campaigns would be over the course of a month throughout the city, next to ads for everything else. This one we were sort of goofing on a Calvin Klein ad that featured Mark Wahlberg, Boston's own. I know he's from Massachusetts, maybe not Boston. Anyway, the homophobe Mark Wahlberg. So everything was very topical. This came out the year that Clinton went into the office and went to his don't ask, don't tell policy in his first public gesture. Of course, that completely backfired. You could be gay in the army as long as you didn't tell anyone. So the other sort of subtext, or not even subtext, but twinned mode of communication in all of this work, as graphic designers, Sue and I are very interested in the history of advertising, of agitprop, of posters, of different kinds of fast communication. So each project that we did used a different language, and this was the, kick your ass revenge movie poster made by lesbians. At the same time, after I'd spent a few years working with Sue on Dyke Action Machine and other activist organizations such as the Lesbian Avengers and Queer Nation, I started to think closely is probably not the right word, fondly, sadly, about what happens when I bring some of this newly, to use a contemporary word, woke knowledge about my own oppression and how I've been seen as a lesbian into a studio practice, into a space that's more private and that's not so outward facing and filled with generalizations. So in other words, what happens if I use it to take up painting or use it to take up drawing? And I started out with doing some very small works that were based on my own photographs from my family. At the time, I was thinking a lot about cliches that were thrown around frequently about lesbians. One of them was that you're too attached to your mother. And again, sort of using or wanting to use kinds of mundane tropes that are easily understood, such as the children's storybook. And again, in the same way that DAM and most of our projects used humor, so too did this work I started doing on my own in my studio. I also was never, ever interested in being a representational painter or drawer. So you could see that in this work. It's like, I'm basically trying to get the image out there. I'm really way more interested in abstraction. Couple of more Dyke Action Machine things. The project we did in 1997, when you were allowed to register your domestic partner at New York City Hall. And it's interesting the speed with which many of these things just kind of sink into the consciousness. So I feel like we're in this moment where, and perhaps this happens to most people who are alive, like history, the cycles are much longer than what we experience during our own minuscule lifespans. It's like a lot of the dialogue although it is framed in appropriately so intersectionality, I think many of the things that people are thinking about were just as pressing, if not more so, when a poster like this was made 20 years ago. And then 20 years before that, 1978. So again, the idea about who gets to be considered an American, another extremely pressing idea culturally right now, as Trump has basically defined his entire presidency on such ideas. This was a lesbian planet that you could only access through the internet, through the interwebs. Our campaign button during Bush's presidency. So around this time, I truly decided, okay, it's time for me to go back to the studio and think about things that think about different ways of expressing my own life experience. And part of my own history is that I had sort of bohemian parents, and I grew up in a family that, feminism was not a dirty word. Feminism was a word my mother introduced to me around age 8. So that would have been 1968. So it's something that's been part of my life, even though it's gone through different relationships with the public. We had many, many years where young women wanted nothing to do with feminism. Thank God that has changed. And thank God we're now at a point where we get to see everything as being interconnected in terms of our own experiences. So I started out with this place, with thinking about sort of feminism in a kind of nostalgic way, a kind of our bodies ourselves manual way, a book that my mother gave me when I was in high school. How do we take care of ourselves? And started to think about that kind of iconography and the iconography of the counterculture. Does it have a place in painting? And combining different languages around silk screens, graphic design, painting. This painting also has glitter and a peacock feather on it. At that point, I had been out of school for quite a long time and decided to go back to graduate school, and I went to Bard, which is where I met Laurel Sparks. So we are very old friends. And these are some, I'm going to show you a couple of the paintings I made there. Again, thinking about, I grew up during the swan song of modernism. Although that was happening, people still were very skittish about including political imagery, text, or anything that sort of tied a painting to a certain time or a certain political movement. That stuff was not included in paintings, except for people like Faith Ringgold. And some women who were working in the feminist art movement. But in general, in the mainstream art world, this idea about abstraction being a kind of blank slate and what happens when imagery is pulled in, or very recognizable imagery. In this case, you see Mao, Lenin, and Marx burning in the sky. This was a painting from graduate school in the year 2000. And I continued working in this vein for a while. What happens when you bring really overt political symbols into the space of painting? and put it in a gallery instead of put it on a street or put it in on a book cover. Obviously, it's combining different interests of mine, some of them being the history of graphic design and history of posters, and with aspects that might signify the end of a kind of radical period in art, such as color field painting, which ended up becoming a kind of corporate lobby art in the end. People are rediscovering it now and looking at it differently, but certainly when I was coming up as a young artist, you could see a a really nice Sam Francis in a Saatchi building lobby. So, it's like the uses of abstraction are also part of abstraction. I threw these in here because I wanted to just give you a little peek at a show that Sheila and I actually did 15 years ago together. It's the first and only other show that we did together at the Palm Beach Institute for Contemporary Art. So this is a little sidebar. We didn't have any collaborative work in that show. Our work sort of sat side by side. And I have to say it's much better having aspects of the show where we're collaborating. So at a certain point in my work, I started to think about how do I actually bring myself back to the language of abstraction that I'm really interested in, and formally, and also maintain different kinds of content that we don't typically or hadn't typically seemed to be allowed, I'm saying that in quotes, within the arena of abstraction, either late modernist abstraction, minimalism, color fields, hard-edged stripe paintings. What's a different way of actually using one's experience to inflect or invent a new kind of abstraction? And for me, one of those sort of signal moments in my thinking in the studio was thinking about how there was a great desire when I was younger and a student to find women in the past who could be my predecessors. And of course, there are very few, at least documented. So is it something that we need to invent? Do I need to invent a kind of feminist past for myself that either roots out people who were not recorded or imagines a different trajectory around how the role of women and women artists has evolved over time? And so I started to use things that were sort of drawn from thinking about essentialist politics, like Judy Chicago, or central core imagery and work that was embraced by the populace, but was severely punished and rejected by the art world as being crass and overly illustrative. But of course, now everybody loves Judy Chicago, so good for her. She made it. She made it through. This is a painting called The Stone Age. Again, thinking about who our ancestors were. Every painter has that moment when they see a hand drawn with smoke on the wall of a cave and thinks, wow, I'm part of a very long line of people who have done this. And there's something both comical and cliche and truly heartfelt about having that moment as a maker. So I continue to think about how graphic design can be used to express a set of ideas around change, around setting up a new kind of symbolism, and then at the same time thinking about stuff that wasn't available to me as a graphic designer, such as pleasure and surface, and what happens when somebody's actually in front of a painting. So these paintings, I started to develop a method in which I used a collage as a base for both pouring and building up layered surfaces. And I think I have an example of it up here somewhere. So as I go through these images, you can see how much more involved I'm getting in tactility, aspects of painting that are outside of, that belong almost exclusively to the practice of painting, like really digging into different areas. And when I started painting again after having this period of doing activism, I started using acrylic paint, which was not how I was trained as an undergrad at Pratt. We learned using oil paint. So the whole process of thinking about paint, what paint meant, the history of paint, the technology of paint, the fact that acrylic paint is a fairly recent invention and since the late 40s, 50s. Therefore, it comes to us with not as much baggage, or a different kind of baggage, which is related to the world outside the studio, since it is plastic after all. And you can see as I move along through these images that they get more voluptuous, more suggestive, more suggestive of body parts. So I'm actually really thinking about something that I think of as a kind of feminist abstraction, which comes out of, you know, people like George O'Keeffe, or someone like Elizabeth Murray, who is not making a painting about the Spanish Civil War, but is making a painting about a teacup on her kitchen table, or a painting that is located in the body, or an abstraction based on looking outside her studio door in Abiquiu, New Mexico. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but you get my point. It's like, what are the life experiences that spur us on, or that are allowed to be inspiration for different kinds of expression using abstraction. And I return often to some of the formal aspects that someone like Judy Chicago used in a piece like The Dinner Party, both playing with it and acknowledging it, but then of course having to throw in some kind of leopard spots on the edge there. I'm just showing you a couple of close-ups because I want you to get a sense of what they look like. They operate very differently depending on where you are in relation to the painting. So I think one of the things that's been important to me is thinking about how my own education in modernism that is based on Bauhaus principles was anything but universal. It was set up as a kind of universal language that we were all going to be able to communicate with each other And in fact, it is really the language of European modernism, and which then has seeped into, you know, corporations like IBM and everything else. Um, but one of the things that I've been interested in is how do we make that distinction? How do we show that distinction? And one of the ways I'm trying to do that or think about it is think about a surface as not being this integrated front. In other words, there was something very important that happened in late modernism in which the surface of a painting needed to be integrated. And, you know, we look at someone like Fiona Ray or postmodern painters who use all different kinds of mark making and surface treatment to signify a breakdown of this sort of monolithic approach to painting. At the same time, I'm interested in thinking about how those surfaces take us outside of painting. This is just a collage to show you how I work. This is the painting that came from that collage. One more collage. Whoops. So I have a table in my studio with a pile of a couple of boxes of color aid paper, and lots of little cutout shapes. And these collages are small; they're around 5 inches. So really, the collage has nothing and everything to do with the resulting painting. I'm thinking of it as a kind of structure. How do I set up a scaffolding? This painting was included in a show called Queer Abstraction that happened, I think it was last summer, at the Des Moines Art Center in Des Moines, Iowa. It's the first show of its kind with this title. And it was a really interesting experience to be part of it, because I think as somebody who grew up during the sort of transition from, you know, or maybe we're still living through the death of modernism, you know, sort of this weird relationship to the perception of abstraction. Abstraction, is it a kind of blank language that's formal? Is it how does it actually communicate? What does queer abstraction look like? Does it look like something, are we queering it because it has limp dicks and weird saggy breasts in it? You know, so then is that abstract at all? So all of these questions float through my mind. They're things I think about a lot. But for me, queer abstraction comes from the idea that it is an expression of experience. It's like, how does our own experience intersect with these different languages that we've inherited? Martha Graham's Candy Stripers. I often collaborate with my wife, Sheila Pepe, on my titles. She's really good at titles. And so we'll sit in front of paintings and make lists of titles. I started out as a modern dancer. So I'm, you know, in the past 10 years or so, I've been thinking about how dance shows up in my work. And, you know, maybe that's some kind of gesture towards Matisse, or the fact that everything is curvilinear, or this idea of trying to keep movement in the painting. or it could be the act of actually pouring. I mean, this painting is very large, it's 86 inches. So the sort of physicality of making a painting like this, in which it's on a table or on the floor and I'm pouring buckets of paint over it and then painting into it, also speaks to a relationship to dance. I'm going to show you a few paintings that were in the Whitney Biennial in 2017. Some of these are also included in the show at the Portland Museum of Art. It was really amazing doing this show with Sheila and Jamie DeSimone, our curator, because we got to sort of look back at all this work. And since we've been together a long time, the dialogue between what we've made separately and together has been, it's kind of like looking at a piece of music or something. So there was great joy in installing the show and actually seeing all of these connections between things and times and things that we talk about at home that then show up in the work. This was also in the biennial. Another way of treating a canvas as if it's this kind of interior space where you're being invited in is using a scrim in front rather than an arch or a window. And all of these are ways I've been thinking about the space of the painting. How do we get into a painting? This painting is also very large. It's about 100 inches tall. So when you're close to it, it basically is consuming. You're seeing it out of your peripheral vision. Sometimes the work I've done with Dyke Action Machine comes back into my paintings, consciously or unconsciously. This painting is called Return to Guided Ohm, referring back to the project that Sue and I did when we made our lesbian planet. We designed a logo for that planet, which you'll find buried in this painting if you want to do the research. You know, I think the paintings are meant to be places. They're taking you somewhere. They're somewhere you haven't been before. So sometimes the work feels like it's located on another planet. Sometimes the work feels like it's located in a petri dish or under a microscope. I'm really interested in all of those experiences, the experience of scale, the experience of tactility and how that communicates scale to us. I'm going to end with a couple of recent paintings. I always get to the point in my talk where I run out of things to say. So I'm just going to show you this and hope that some of the words I've said earlier will flash before your mind right now. As always, I'm thinking about humor. How can abstraction be funny? I mean, I think humor is this amazing tool. Usually it's connected to our bodies. Here's another one that's directly connected to our bodies. And again, these are paintings that kind of need to be seen in person. So all of the stuff up top is iridescent. You have no sense of that as you're looking at it here because they change as you move around them. This is based on a a book called The Secret Life of Trees, which no doubt many of you have read. Another aspect of sort of seismic cultural change that's going on right now, how we're treating the environment, how we're thinking about plants and animals and what their communications are with us. I mean, for me, I have long been interested in a kind of abstraction that has a relationship to nature. So in earlier works where I talked about the body, I'm talking about the body as a sort of social body, but I'm also thinking about the body in terms of bodies made of, chloroform, bodies, animal bodies. And I'm just going to leave you with this one. This is called Zaftig. It's a painting from last summer. I don't have a good slide of it, so you're seeing it in my studio. Newly using a lot of graphite and pencil directly onto prime canvas as a way of setting up a different texture and setting up a different set of mark making and setting up a different reference for the viewer in terms of what these forms can do. And I think I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Carrie. Can everyone maybe turn on their video so we can give Carrie a round of applause? Thank you.
It's the sound of one hand clapping.
Right, my hand. I see that Laurel and some other folks have questions, but I just wanted to start off with two questions, if you wouldn't mind, Carrie. One is, yeah. I went to a talk in Chicago maybe 2 years ago on the idea of pleasure activism, and they were associating the writing of Octavia Butler, and this sort of sense of where a body who would normally be marginalized in the larger culture, to have that body at rest, to have that body in a sense of joy itself could be a kind of activistic state. And I wondered what you thought about that.
Oh, I love that. I mean, it's funny. I just started, it's so weird because I feel like my paintings are thinking about things like science fiction and stuff these days, but I don't know that much about it. So I have started to read Octavia Butler. I read Kindred, which is absolutely mind-blowing, about basically African-American who has to go back in time to save the white slave owner of his or her grandparents so that she could live in the future. It's like this amazing book. I'm not doing it justice, but pleasure in the marginalized body, incredibly important. I mean, I feel like this has been a sort of through line in gay activism since the early 70s. We think of some groups like the Coquettes, for example, who did a lot of drag, and their work was based on all kinds of pleasure, not only the pleasure of dressing up and the pleasure of making yourself into someone else, but the pleasure of wearing velvet or the pleasure of being sparkly. So that's definitely part of this work. And I think that's one of the things that I've been most interested in recent years in terms of women painters who are dealing with abstraction. It feels like that aspect of pleasure and a sort of sense of ourselves as not only these exteriorized beings to be looked at, but actually what's happening internally is starting to show up in painting. And it's something I'm really enjoying.
I guess one quick note about that, because we have a lot of questions here. Could you talk a little bit more about sort of patterning? Because I've seen patterning come up a lot more in students' work. in the last few years, and I liked how you associated that, also the sort of politics and history of it, and then how you saw yourself as a kind of art historical scavenger. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about where you see like a potential radical position for patterning in the work.
Well, I think that if students, spend the time and, dip into their pocketbooks right now, there's some really good shows on the P&D movement that have happened in the US in the past couple years. And for me, I actually was a student during the time of the P&D movement, which was, by the way, propagated, if you will, that's not the right word, by both male and female artists. But it was basically thinking about what has been allowed into the discourse around modernism. Are there other ways to think about craft? Are there other ways to think about domestic arts that have never been allowed into the canon? I mean, Gee's Bend and those quilts are probably the most obvious example of something like that. But during the 70s, people like Robert Kushner and everyone, Miriam Shapiro, I mean, the people working with femage, which was a term that she invented, were thinking about how the decorative expresses so many things that have not been allowed into the discourse of Western art history or sort of canonical modernist history. They talk about class, they talk about gender, they talk about sexuality. And I think that's been really evident in some of these shows that have been up.
Great. I'm just going to call on folks, and if you can unmute yourself. Laurel, you had a question?
Hi, Carrie.
Hi, Laurel.
I miss you. I'm so happy to see you.
I'm so happy to see you. I love your patterned wall.
Oh, well, thank you. It's Mannheimer in your honor. So you said that when we were in school together and you started employing some sort of color field tropes in your work, and how when you were initially in art school, and actually I would even argue at that time where that sort of language of modernism, and especially like reductive modernist abstraction, was so kind of off the table and sort of dismissed. And you said that people are thinking differently about that now. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that more, that statement.
Wait, say that again. Oh, are you talking about color field painting?
No, modernism in general. You were specifically referring to that, your use of color field painting, but you were talking about that sort of basically modernist language as being something that at that point was off the table, and at this point people are thinking about it differently. And I'm just wondering if you could talk more about how they're thinking about it differently and maybe why you think so.
Well, I mean, I have many thoughts on this, as you know. One of them is that I don't think modernism, as much as people who are involved with postmodernism want to, I mean, is postmodernism even a thing anymore? It was important to me when I was a student, but in a funny way, it feels like modernism won. It's like the language around modernism, or even how we talk about formalism. And I think this is actually a problem within places like art school, is it's still relying on modernism and thinking through modernism. In other words, form is paramount. It's like, are we going to talk about what form is connected to? Are we going to talk about what form signifies? So somehow these things that were seemingly split during the era of postmodernism, especially, it becomes a kind of crisis within painting, because we don't read painting in the way that it was read by Greenberg anymore. So it's like, how do we develop a language that both honors where people come from and takes into account different kinds of influences that show up in the work, and also educates the viewer on what those influences are. And I'm old enough so that I'm still very much embedded in this old history, but I can see it in my students. And you know, modernism is just one thing that is a factor. It's not the thing. It's it's one aspect of talking about the work. It's not the central place that we come from anymore. So this whole way of, you know, I almost feel like now when I'm talking to painting students, I want them to tell me before I even get to a critique of their work. It's like, you know, who are you thinking about here? And I'm not just talking about painters, I'm talking about all sorts of things. And then how do we fold that into thinking about something like abstraction? I mean, I think that's where the idea of social abstraction has to come from.
Great. Just looking at the chat box, James Porter and then Oliver.
Hi, Carrie. Thanks so much for your presentation. Especially great to see your new work, which I'm really excited by. I'm really struck by the shapes in your work and how strong the shape making is. And I wonder if you could speak to specifically that aspect of your practice.
Oh, thank you for your question. You know, that's like if somebody asked me about my color palette. It's the place in my mind that goes blank. But I will try to, you know, and maybe it's because it's the most like, you know, like that's where all the feeling is too. A lot of what I do with the shapes is I use a blade to cut paper out. That's where a lot of my shapes come from. I'm kind of sitting at a table with a blade and cutting out shapes in colored paper, and then thinking about them in terms of how they could be used in larger compositions. But I'm always I'm interested in shapes that are sort of that give off a sense of animation. I would say or that are funny in some way, which to me might be one and the same depending on the painting. Yeah, does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Oliver, you had a question?
Hi, Carrie.
Hi, I'm gonna change. Can I stop my screen sharing?
Yeah, you can stop it.
Okay, so I can actually see people. Oh, that's great.
All right.
Hi, Oliver.
Hi. I don't see me, but I guess I don't need to see me.
I see you.
First of all, I'm sorry, this might be a little redundant with Laurel's question. So you may have answered it in part, if not completely, but I was really struck by your comment that the uses of abstraction are a part of abstraction. And I guess I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit, and sort of how I understand that, I guess, is to mean that in part that abstraction is such a sort of sign for something now in the modernist roots of abstraction that it almost can't be, that it is content in and of itself, that history is part of the content of the work. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that. And also I noticed that the use of drop shadows and things seem tied to, you know, graphic design, but also to a particular digital form of graphic design, possibly. So I'm wondering if you could talk about the relationship of those things as well.
Yeah, that is something that you know, part of my history is that I was, I went into graphic design after I graduated from Pratt and was an early user of sort of standalone electronic design systems. You know, this predates like Macs or anything like that. So the language of graphic design and the sort of visual tropes that get used to indicate illusion or space or whatever have been kind of lodged in my brain for a long time. And it's something that I don't usually frame in that way, but I actually think that's where it comes from. Often I'm thinking about it being a sort of transgression against what we think of as abstraction, in the same way that Picabia might have made those collages in the 50s, or the paintings in the 50s in which things were flat and then they were spatial or had shadows, or so it represents sort of smart ass, you know, joke or something, painting joke. But I actually truly think it also comes from the amount of digital stuff I consume and think about, and that has just become this kind of weird convention that we accept when we, you know, look at a flow chart that has drop shadows under it. It's like, what the fuck? What is a flow chart with drop shadows under it? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Or a gradient, for example. So these things come from photography, obviously, but they also have come to be this kind of unexamined sign system that we see every day. In terms of the meanings of abstraction being part of the meaning of abstraction, I'm not paraphrasing myself well. It's more about thinking about the fact that for many years, well, at least in my lifetime, as a child, I always thought of abstract painting as being like the pinnacle. You know, to be an abstract painter meant you were a very intellectual, pure painter. It's like becoming, you know, Ad Reinhardt or something. It's like you got rid of everything. You didn't need it, you know. So there's this idea that this kind of blankness is meaningful, which I absolutely reject at this point. But I think that that's also part of the history of abstraction, and that has a, you know, and I think in my own work, I'm touching on different histories and what they've meant in that way, in the sort of circumscribed arena of the art world. If that answers your question.
It opens up many others as well. But
I see a question by Peter and then one by Jan.
We're having a holiday here in Sunset Park, apparently. Hi, Peter.
Carrie, thanks so much for that.
I forgot you were there.
I am in one of the screens.
Good to see you.
Likewise. So I think Oliver sort of anticipated some of this question, but I'm curious to know more about it, because I when I first discovered your work, I found it very, very internally complex, and toggling between all of these different influences. And I'm so fascinated by this graphic design influence as well. And I guess this speaks really, I guess, maybe to my own fixation with certain moments and eras of graphic design. And I'm wondering if there's, much like these early digital technologies are lodged in your mind, is there a specific period or iteration of graphic design that is also somehow informing this work? Because it recalls certain things to me, but I'm wondering if there's some kind of era, like some kind of classic rock version deeply embedded as a structure for you.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think in some of the earlier work, and I didn't show you much of it because I I know many of the people in the audience have heard me give talks a lot, so I wanted to try to do something different if I could. I don't know if I succeeded, but you know, so some of the earlier work I was thinking about people like Rodchenko and sort of uses of, and then, you know, Atelier Populaire, some of the uses of like May 68 graphics that were then recycled by people like Naomi Klein. You know, what is the lifespan of some of these leftist graphics? But for me, I think, you know, some of the things I constantly return to and I'm thinking about are some of the posters that Faith Ringgold made in the late 60s. I'm also really into Ben Shahn in the way that he draws. And so I'm thinking a lot about both his posters and his drawing and the combination of two, but also thinking about things like super graphics in airports, you know, like stuff from the 70s, like very large painted walls. So, and I've done a lot of other things that have spoofed on corporate logos and stuff. So I feel like some of that stuff sinks in some funny way, a kind of plasticity or a sort of pop sensibility. But yeah, for me, you know, I'm really interested in the sort of era of the 60s and 70s, probably because I was born in 1960. My parents were, you know, hippies. I grew up around all that stuff. And it has a very romantic, nostalgic attachment for me, to be honest.
Well, it's also, if I may say, phenomenal.
Yes.
So I completely nerd out on that specific moment.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you.
Hi, Jen, you had a question?
Hi, Carrie.
Hi, Jan.
I,
How are you?
I just love looking at the paintings. Incredible, incredible work.
Thank you.
So I have a question that has to do with when you first came to New York, a time when there weren't many lesbian painters, well, around or showing. And so I'm just wondering if you had any encounters with Louise Fishman.
Oh, absolutely. She was at Pratt. I was a student at Pratt. She was there. I never had her as a teacher, which was a great sorrow to me. But I knew that she was at Pratt. And I have since done a lot of different projects with her where I've interviewed her and been on panels. And but yeah, I mean, it in a funny way, it's like that would have made, you know, I turned out fine, but that would have made a huge difference to me. I had, you know, because at the same time I was having male faculty tell me things like, oh, it makes sense your paintings have holes in them because you're a woman.
Oh.
So, you know, this is like the early 80s. It's not, yeah. So I think as students are today, people are very hungry for affirmation of your worldview or what you're going through. Yeah. And it also felt like there weren't that many, that's why I got really interested in Elizabeth Murray, because she felt like this very strong figure who was doing like really inventive, original things. And I didn't know her, but she was someone in New York and around, you know what I mean?
I think one of the ways that women painters survived, and I don't think it's so much of an issue now, was through teaching.
Yes.
You know, I mean, community building. Galleries weren't showing women artists, much less lesbian artists. In conversation with Louise, she mentioned consciousness raising groups, but not of, I mean, and of course she was talking about the late 60s and early 70s, but still just this dearth of women painters that had some kind of presence. So yeah, I know of your more recent work. I was just wondering about early encounters and how you might have known about her. Or
I think I knew, I don't know how I knew who she was, honestly. But I knew that there was a lesbian painter teaching at Pratt.
Oh, okay.
And I'd never made contact with her at that time. However, as I got older, I did things like I wrote Harmony Hammond a letter. That's how I became friends with her. It was like, I need people in my, I need to be in touch with these people who have sort of set the path for me. And I also need them to know who I am. You know what I mean? It's like there needs to be some kind of communication that goes back and forth, because it feels very lonely a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Good thing to do.
And obviously less so now, but at that time for sure.
Right.
Hi, I see one more question by Craig Stockwell. And again, if anyone else has a question, please put it in the chat box so we know that you're there to ask it. Craig?
Yeah, hi. I wonder,
Hi.
can you bring up that last painting that you had? Is that easy to do?
Yeah, I think so. Let's see.
Yeah, great.
You see it?
Yep,
Yeah.
got it. So my question, and it has a little bit to do with the conversation around modernism and such. This, and in a lot of the conversations with students and crits and all, there's always this term that comes up, something about, contemporary language, and something that exists now that this painting just could not have existed 15 years ago, and certainly not 50 years ago. And there is something absolutely about this moment right now that has brought this painting into being. That being said, it's filled with references in terms of modernist painting and traditional painting and drawing. So it's not like you're stepping away completely from them. And my point about modernism earlier was, you mentioned that modernism is all over the art schools now when you walk around and look at work. But I think it's the look of modernism. The intention of modernism is gone. We're not believing that we're really getting somewhere.
Yeah.
So this painting. So my question to you is, looking at this painting, what are the things in this painting that to you are just very much out of the vocabulary of 2020?
Oh God, I don't know if I can do that.
I could take a poke at it if you don't.
Okay, go ahead.
Well,
I
color.
mean, I think go ahead.
Color.
Go ahead.
Color, for one thing, and also I think the strange use of graphic tools. Again, the drop shadow, as Oliver was talking about, and such like that. But so that's a start. Where would you go?
I mean, to me, when I look at this painting, I think of I mean, and maybe I'm just too in my head, or too, like, I've just been in the art world too fucking long. But it's like, the thing about abstraction where everyone's always trying to see a face or something. So it's like, I feel like there's this weird desire for abstraction to always be asked to be something else. And I don't know if I'm participating in that or foiling it or playing it both ways. So that's one thing I think of. I mean, to me, I'm thinking of people like Leger when I make a painting like this. So I'm thinking about space and how space gets set up in a painting. So I don't know if that
Yeah, and I think also,
answers your question, but your comment.
and I think that sensibility of contradiction too, that
Right.
yeah, you're giving us stuff here that's referential, but
Right.
but none of it kind of is dogmatic and clear, and the reference doesn't take us to specific places. So
Right. Yes.
you know, both in terms of image and history. Yeah, thank you.
Welcome. Thanks for the comment.
Great. Any other questions for Carrie at this moment? Otherwise, let's unmute and give her a proper round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
I will see 6 of you later today,
Okay.
I believe.
Sure. Great. Well, thank
Okay.
you.
Carrie.
All right, take care.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Carrie.
Great to
That
see
was amazing.
Bye.
I know I will, but I have meetings soon, so. We're gonna spend an hour and a half talking about how to reiterate this fall, especially with the new, like how